So, you know, just looking at some of the stories that are emanating from various sectors of the agricultural economy in Africa, we know that there is dire droughts going on in various regions. We also know that some regions are producing more than what they need, and unfortunately there's just a massive gap between what Africa can produce and what Africa is producing. And then we've got biotechnology in this whole mix to try and ensure that we feed the unfed, and then we also try and ensure that we increase capacity and increase production. Give us the context of where we stand right now from an agricultural perspective on the African continent.
Well, I believe in the terms of African continent, we still stand on what you call great potential, untapped potential, because definitely, as we agree, Africa, everybody agrees, is the last continent that's likely to feed the world, and I'm a strong believer of that. But before we reach there, we have work to do. We still have a lot of land that is untapped. We have natural resources. We have a big population that is really a big market right within Africa. We're importing a lot of grain. We are spending a lot of money on foreign exchange, importing standard grain like maize, wheat, rice, barley, everything. And that's definitely a big internal market that's unmet. A few countries like South Africa are able to produce surplus and export internally, but many of the other African countries are just importing. And so we are really in this crossroad of great potential, demonstrated that we can produce from companies that are coming and investing in Africa, but still have majority of the people, especially smallholder farmers, starving, unable to feed themselves. We have areas of surplus, as you indicated, and great surplus, areas of deficit.
Yeah. So, I mean, Dr. Wambugu, you mentioned that, you know, Africa is still just not producing enough from an agricultural perspective. We're importing a lot. What are some of the hindrances? And also just looking what Africa Harvest has been up to from a biotechnology perspective, you are looking to produce seeds for Africans, for the African continent, and also make technological advances and, of course, intellectual property that will be owned by Africans.
Yes, as you easily said, that we are not, you cannot develop a country without embracing technology. And I think the biggest challenge we have is what you call demonstrated potential and ability to produce. If I take a standard crop like maize or wheat or in fact rice, we are producing a small percentage of what we could produce. For example, Africa on average, we are producing 1.7 metric tons per acre. We could produce 6. So even half of what we should produce, we are not doing it. The reason being lack of inputs, but also technology. We need hybrid seeds. We need to use water, irrigation, good policies, roads, networks. Many things are interrelated, definitely. And unless you can actually have major interventions like what happened in Asia 50 years ago, we're still going to have this potential that's untapped, what you call a sleeping giant. We look at what China has done recently, not in too many years ago. China is now not a sleeping giant anymore, but one of the global powers when it comes to feeding themselves that we're reaching out. We need to do similar, very transformational, we need to have a transformational policies, transformational minds, and do things very differently.
Yeah. You mentioned something really interesting on the irrigation side of things, and we don't really have policy with regards to that. And you'll also find a lot of the would-be farmers, you know, obviously battle with irrigation. Do you think that it's something that should be controlled by the state? Do you think the private sector needs to get involved? How do you think we should overcome this challenge?
I think it needs to be done along what I call the whole value chain. We have had, in some of the areas, Africa Harvest is working in the dry areas. What is needed there is not big irrigation dams that are going to maybe damage the environment. It's simply small sat dams, small managing the water, tapping the water into shallow wells or small dams before letting the water all onto the Indian Ocean. So there are some small things that could be done immediately. Of course, the major thing is going to come to government investing in water catchment areas. Like you have done in South Africa, indeed South Africa, every farm has got a dam. That means when it rains, instead of the water becoming a hazard and water drowning people and destroying the environment, the water becomes something to be tapped as a natural resource. and then it's used later actually to irrigate when the drought comes.
Yeah.
And we know for sure Africa is going to have times of drought. So there is need for government to invest in water management, irrigation, but it's also small things that could be done which are not necessarily very expensive. Yeah. And that comes from good government policy as
Absolutely.
well.
So Dr. Wambugu, I mean, you mentioned South Africa, and we obviously, you know, produce a lot more than what is required, and that's why we have the capacity to export. We also know a lot of the wheat and the maize that we produce is actually genetically modified, and we also know that it's basically the hybrid seeds that you were talking of. Do you think that that is what it's going to take to push capacity even higher on the African continent? And, you know, just looking at some of the challenges and some of the criticism when it comes to that, I mean, how do you weigh up those two factors when it comes to safety and making sure that technology is going to work for the benefit of the people?
You see, all technologies come with a risk, and whether it's a load, you have to have what I call regulatory, or you have systems for regulatory. Now, agriculture biotechnology need to be handled through regulatory systems, and the governments need to have regulatory systems, as well as to communicate with the people, because there are fears out there. And if I look at what's happening in the rest of Africa, some countries where government has gone out, like Kenya now, we've got a regulatory policy, but that's not enough. We still have to create awareness, dialogue with all people across the board, with the NGO, with the civil society, and most important, assure people with information and with the proof that truly there is no risk. And so it needs community engagement, it needs good regulatory, and the regulatory must be science-based. And that is happening slowly. But I'm a strong believer in technology, all technologies and biotechnology, but I also know that's not enough. You still have to invest in water, you have to invest in fertilizer, yeah, in other areas. Technology is only 20–30% of the equation, the rest is truly investing to make agriculture more productive.
Are we making headway when it comes to technology, or are we relying on, you know, the big names in the industry such as DuPont and Monsanto? Can we actually make a name for ourselves and create things that will be used for Africans, by Africans, and again, then, as I mentioned, the intellectual property owned by us, so that we're not reliant on paying big multinational companies for the use of their seeds?
Well, unfortunately, we are still there, because many of the products, even in South Africa, which are there, are definitely owned by the big companies. But what is important is not where things come from, because we're still using other things that come from other companies, like the medicine and so on. It's really what I call sharing the profit. For example, we look at cotton, whether in Kenya, in Burkina Faso, the cotton coming from private sector is making a contribution across the society, small-scale farmers, large-scale farmers, across the board. Is everybody benefiting? It's not necessarily where it came from. If we are all benefiting, there's nothing wrong in us using it, because global innovations need to be shared. At the same time, we need to develop our own laboratories, our own capacity, so we can customize, especially when it comes to African crops, because the big companies invest in global markets. Yeah. You look in Africa, we have African crops that they're not going to invest in, and we should be the people to do it. In Africa Harvest, we're already involved in sorghum, nutrition enhancement, and definitely big companies are not going to look at sorghum because it's an African crop, or banana and all that. So there's a balance between what companies can do for us. We must do some of it ourselves, because it's important to African continent.
Absolutely. Thank you so very much. Great to have you on the program. That was Dr. Florence Wambugu, Chief Executive Officer at Africa Harvest Biotech Foundation International.